Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me join our Vice President to thank the Institute for hosting this event. We just had a media and press conference this morning to launch this report. So we are very happy, very pleased to come to the university and the institute to give a presentation to the academia scholars here. So what I'm going to do is just since Vice President already explained some background why we are updating the figures, so I'll just go straight to this report. So this report, we have three objectives. The first is to look at how infrastructure conditions vary across countries. Certainly, the region has invested a lot, but there are large variations across country in terms of infrastructure conditions. Second is to update ADB's estimates of infrastructure investment needs for the region, developing Asia, over the 15 years time from 2016 to 2030. So the last time the numbers were released in 2009. And then we briefly discussed the policy actions for how to meet infrastructure investment needs in the region. So that is the objective of the report. So let me just start with the key messages. Some of the messages the Vice President already mentioned. So basically, the developing Asia needs $26 trillion US. This is in 2015 prices, or $1.7 trillion US per year for infrastructure investment between the 2016 and 2030, so 15 years time. But without climate change mitigation and adaptation, the needs are $22.5 trillion or $1.5 trillion per year. Obviously, these figures are more than double ADB's 2009 estimates. And we also found the infrastructure investment gaps, because the gap is defined as the difference between the projected needs and the current investment. So projected needs and the current investment, that's the difference defined as a gap. The gap varies across countries. So we looked at 25 countries with good data in 2016 and 2020. 5 years time, we have good reliable data. The gap is about 2.4% of the projected GDP. However, if we exclude China, this gap will rise to 5% of the projected GDP. So that 5% is quite significant. And we believe that both public and private sectors must increase infrastructure financing. And to achieve that, structural reforms are the key. So these are the key messages. So let's start just the first question, how much Asia is investing in infrastructure. So this chart shows the positive correlation between per capita GDP and infrastructure stock. So the horizontal is infrastructure stock, is the index, and the vertical is per capita GDP. So we know that we all, the research on infrastructure. So infrastructure played an important role as a key factor of production, the enabler of trade and investment, a driver of productivity growth, and of course the essential public services. So obviously you can find a close correlation, but of course this is a correlation doesn't necessarily the causality, right? So we know that in economics, we try to establish causality is more difficult, but certainly we think it is a two-way causality from infrastructure to development outcomes, and from development outcomes to infrastructure. So that's what I would frame that. Now, the region as a whole has invested quite significantly in infrastructure in the last 20, 30 years, especially in China, as we all know. And however, both the quantity and the quality of infrastructure still inadequate in larger parts of the region. This chart on the left-hand side, we show the electricity generation capacity for the developing Asia as a whole. The region actually invests quite a lot. From 2000 to 2012, the annual growth was 7.4% compared to OECD, only 1.9%, and for other developing countries, 1.1%. However, if you look at the country data, if you look at the level, so there's a large difference. For instance, in country, Nepal, Cambodia, Bangladesh, or even India, the level of the electricity generation capacity per capita is only less than 10% of the OECD level. So it is quite startling, the difference, the level of per capita electricity generation capacity in the kilowatt per capita in 2012 for many countries are less than 10% of the OECD level. Even for China, for instance, we know that China invests a lot. The level is only about less than half of the OECD level. So there are large gaps in terms of infrastructure provision. And on the right-hand side, we show that the transmission and distribution loss of the electricity. So for countries, for instance, Nepal, Cambodia, Myanmar, the 30%, up to 30% of the electricity generated were lost in distribution and transmission. But on the other hand, we have a good performer like Malaysia and Korea and Singapore. So the loss much smaller. So basically, we want to show that there are large infrastructure investment that has been rapid in the region, but still there are large gaps in both in terms of quantity and quality. So this chart, but of course, obviously the condition of infrastructure depends on the investment, right? So here we look at what is the country, the level of infrastructure investment as a percent of GDP, how these numbers look like. So we know that the infrastructure data are extremely difficult to collect. So normally you don't find the right statistics and, for instance, official data. So really you have to go into detailed budget data. And so here we use the government budget data on the infrastructure investment for the four sectors: the power, transport, telecommunication, water, and sanitation. So the four sectors is the government budget data plus the World Bank. There's a database called the private participation in infrastructure database. So provide cross-country infrastructure projects information, the private sector participate. So we put this together, we found that infrastructure investment varies significantly across countries. In Bangladesh, for instance, Mongolia, Pakistan is about 2% of GDP. On the other hand, we have the China and Bhutan, Vietnam. China is close to 7%. Vietnam, India, even also very high, more than 5%. So there's a large difference across countries. And also the private sector participation in infrastructure, this brown color, also varies. For some countries, infrastructure investment is dominated by basically the government sector, the public sector, China, and Bhutan, and Mongolia, for instance. But on the other hand, the Indian, the 40% private sector financed, and Philippines, Pakistan, 50% private financed, and the Maldives, 80% private. So there are the large variations across countries. And this chart shows that some sectors are more attractive to private sector financing than others. So obviously, telecommunications are more attractive, are most attractive actually. 3/4 of investment in 2011 was financed by private sector. Power sector is about a half, 50%, transport 20%. But the water and sanitation predominantly the public sector. So now there are two criteria. Normally we look at why this the private sector versus public sector. So one is the feasibility of the cost recovery. How easily you can impose user charges. If the easily you can do, then more private sector will come. Another is desirability. How desirable? Because some of the projects. Public goods and externality, so you really, the user charge may not be good from economic or social point of view. So that is what it tells here. The water and sanitation, certainly there's a strong externality, so that's why government dominant. But on the other hand, telecommunication, it's easier to have the user charge. Everybody uses a mobile phone, you pay the subscription, all these things. So that is the idea of, I think that's underlying behind the the underlying economic reason. So the second part, we look at this, basically we assess infrastructure needs for the region. For the 45 ADBs developing member countries, and for the period of 2016-2030, Let me just talk about the methodology. Basically, we follow the same methodology as used by 2009 study. It's a top-down approach. So we generate two sets of estimates. One is baseline estimates. It's based on empirical relationship between each type of infrastructure, for instance, kilowatts of electricity, or kilometers of roads. And this on the dependent variable, and the explanatory variables are economic and demographic factors like GDP growth, per capita GDP, industry production, share, and urbanization, urban population, that kind of variables. So, based on that kind of empirical relationship, we project the variables, explanatory variables for the future, and then we get what the infrastructure stocks needed to support, for instance, certain level of GDP growth, and then we come out with the investment needs estimate. So this is broadly the idea based on the relationship between each type of infrastructure and economic and demographic factors. So that's the baseline estimates. Now for the second setup is a climate-adjusted estimates, we call. Basically, we take into consideration the investment needs for climate mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation here, we mainly focus on climate proofing. Basically make infrastructure more reliable and resilient. So that's the idea. So basically, climate-adjusted estimates are the baseline estimates plus the investment needs for mitigation and adaptation. The mitigation, climate mitigation estimates need is basically we use a global energy model. The idea is that in order for Asia to contribute to meet the 2-degree global climate goal, we know that Paris Agreement has this global climate goal to limit the global mean temperature increase below 2 degrees from pre-industrial level. So in order to achieve that goal, what Asia's contribution we have to do in terms of mitigation. So climate proofing basically on the basis of ADB's experience, we have done a lot of projects what normally require a certain % of the investment needs. So that's a plus add on to the baseline estimates. So this gives climate adjusted estimates. So that's the methodology. Now, so let me now turn to the results. Basically, this table presents both sets of the estimates, baseline and climate adjusted. As I said, climate adjusted is the baseline plus mitigation and adaptation needs, right? So let's look at the climate adjusted, let's look at the bottom two rows. For Asia and Pacific, there are 45 developing member countries of ADB. And the climate adjusted estimates the total infrastructure investment needs will be $26 trillion from 2016 to 2030, right? That's the $26 trillion. That comes basically $1.7 trillion a year, and the equivalent to 5.9% of GDP. So 5.9% of GDP. On the other hand, and the baseline, because without climate adaptation, mitigation adaptation, the total needs will be $22.5 trillion for the 15 years time, and that's 1.5 trillion a year, and it comes to 5.1% of GDP. So that is a broad number. The headline numbers, some newspapers have already been reporting. And then, of course, you can see from the more sub-regional data, there are the larger valuations. East Asia is the largest need, it has the largest needs, dominated by China, obviously, and South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, and the Pacific. But if you look at as a percent of GDP, interestingly, the Pacific has the highest number, 9.1% of GDP. So obviously, Pacific, there's a need, they're vulnerable to climate change, and also more costly to build infrastructure. So that explains. And South Asia also the second, and then Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. So that is I think that the key results I want to present. Okay, so this by sector, the power sector actually is the most, has the largest needs. We're talking about $14.7 trillion in over 15 years' time, accounted for 53% of the total, and followed by transport. Transport here, we're talking about roads and railways, seaports and airports. Is 32%, $8.3 trillion, and telecommunication is about 9%, $2.3 trillion, and then we have water and sanitation, 3%, $800 billion. So this is a cross-section, the by sector, the needs, all in 2015 prices. Okay, now the third part, the last part of my presentation, basically here we want to look at how to meet infrastructure needs, how to close the infrastructure investment gaps. So here, because of the data limitation, we only focus on 25 developing member countries of ADB and with good data, and it's for the period of 2016 and 2020, in 5 years' time. So data are more reliable. We focus on that. So the first question is we ask is how big are the investment gaps for these 25 countries, right? And then we talk about how to finance these gaps. So the first row, we show that for the 25 countries I mentioned in 2015, the total infrastructure investment is $881 billion. $881 billion. And we know that for these 25 countries, the annual needs and the climate-adjusted scenario, annual needs is $1.34 trillion. So that means this gives up the gap of $460 billion, $459 billion, right? So this is equivalent to 2.4% of GDP. So if for the 25 countries here, that includes China, the gap is about 2.4% of GDP. On the other hand, if we take China out without China, 24 countries, the total, the estimated current investment in 2015 is close to $200 billion, 195. Annual needs is $500 billion, so this gives us the gap about $308 billion. So this will be 5% of GDP, 5% of GDP. So for China, we list separately the current investment in 2015 is $686 billion. And annual needs, according to us, I estimate is 837. So this gives a gap of $151 billion, is equivalent of 1.2% of GDP. So obviously, in China, even though there are high level of investment in infrastructure, there are still gaps out there because of the China is such a big country, and also urbanization, as well as the need to address climate change, developing renewable energy. So that's we still see this infrastructure investment gap compared to the current rate. Okay, so now the next question is how to bridge the gap. But here, as I said, China, even though the gap is small compared to other countries, so we want to focus on the countries where the gap are most significant. So the 24 countries, basically here, we exclude China for the period of 2016 to 2020. So for these 24 countries, the current investment in 2015 was $195 billion, as I said earlier in the previous table. So of which 63 billion by private sector, and the public is about $133 billion. So that is the current. Now, the approach is that we first figure out how much more the public sector can invest in infrastructure for these 24 countries. So because, as we showed earlier, in Asia, still the majority of the infrastructure is still by public sector, right? So we look at the public sector, how much more they can come up with, to increase infrastructure investment. So basically, we do this fiscal space analysis. We looked at the potential of increasing infrastructure investment through tax reform, increase tax revenue, one. right? And the second is the increased financing for infrastructure through spending reorientation. So for instance, the government can cut subsidy to the fuel subsidy, right? So many countries have fuel subsidy, so if that can be reduced, they can invest in infrastructure. Third is several countries can still have the room to borrow, public sector borrowing, bank loans or the bonds, right? So these are the sources we looked at, and we did a very detailed calculation. What we found is that for these 24 countries, there is a potential to increase public spending on infrastructure by $121 billion annually for the period of 2016 to 2020. So this is public sector additional. Then the remaining, there's a difference between the total needs and the current investment and the additional public, the residual part, right, will be the private sector, right? So this is our approach. So we look at what's the gap, and then what's the additional public, and then the remaining part, remaining part of the gap will be for the private sector. That comes up with about $187 billion. And so that means the private sector investment in infrastructure will have to increase from currently $63 billion to $250 billion, right? An increase by $187 billion annually for the next 5-year period. Now the question, of course, whether this is achievable or not. So that is answer here. Basically, we believe that by and large, obviously, the region has a larger savings, and so potentially can be achieved provided that we have a good policy actions. So the report will look at the 3 sets of policy actions. The first is fiscal reforms. As I mentioned, if the government wants to have additional spending on infrastructure, then we have to have tax reforms, for instance, introduce. So by and large, on average, developing Asia's tax revenue as a percent of GDP compared to the world, average is still low. So there is scope there to increase tax revenue. And for instance, you can introduce green tax, capital gain tax, property tax, that kind of tax, right? And the second is spending reorientation to reduce fuel subsidies, right? So that you can free up financing for that, and then borrowing. So as I mentioned, in addition to this, the government can also raise non-tax revenues. For instance, capture the land value. So this is very common in China. So you have agricultural land, and then you can sell to the highest bidder, and then you get revenue. So that becomes the local government revenue, and then it can be used for infrastructure investment. And also user charges. User charges for some feasible or desirable, some infrastructure, you can use user charges, and that provide additional finance. So that's the first. And the second set is to promote private participation. So basically here we discuss the need to create a conducive investment climate and make greater use of private-public partnerships. PPPs is very coming in a big way, and many countries are promoting, and also international forum, for instance, G20 and APEC are promoting the greater use of PPP. And then the deepening capital markets is important, especially the bond markets. So third set of reform is actually we need a better planning and design execution. So we need to have a pipeline of bankable projects so that the private sector can come in, and of course as well as the public sector, right? So not just financing, not just things discussed, but we need better planning, and we need the design and execution of the project. This is very important. For some countries, this is a big constraint. So let me finally, I don't know, time is running out. Just give me 2 minutes. Role of MDB. So the ADB is a multilateral development bank in developing Asia. There's the World Bank, for instance. There's also Islamic Development Bank, and then now we have the AIIB. So certainly, we see MDB infrastructure financing important. In 2015, is about 2.5% of total current investment. That is a number 2.5%, but the number is small. However, if we exclude China and India, the MDB share increased to more than 10%. So 10% is quite significant. And so we consider for ADB that our financing will increase. We are scaling up our annual loan and grant approvals from $17.5 billion in 2016 to more than $20 billion by 2020. And a growing share of our loans will go to the private sector. So for MDB, the financing is limited. However, we are not just providing financing, but we are blending financing with expertise, and cross-country knowledge. We support policy reforms, and we promote regional cooperation. So our value added go far beyond just simple financing. As the Vice President said, we in the knowledge. ADB is not. We try to become a knowledge bank. So that I think that's the last slides. That's just a repeat of the key messages. So I will stop from here. Thank you.